Let's tune it. One of the things that would be sort of a hoot is to find out that all of this has been for naught, because, in fact, many of the things that people are fighting for don't really exist. And the Pope of the Jews, Ben Shapiro, he has been the one who's taken upon himself to decide who is and is not actually Jewish, which has been very helpful for me and my family. It's in some instances let us off the hook for a couple of things. But here is Ben Shapiro is also now the Pope of racism.
Oh, boy.
Adding to his portfolio.
The religion of wokeness has now taken over. As I've said before, and I will say again, virtually everybody agrees on certain basic propositions. Racism, bad. Police brutality, bad. Rioting and looting, bad. But we have now reached the point where a huge swath of Americans are arguing for something different, about which there should be and is widespread disagreement. One is the proposition that America is endemically racist and evil, that black people are under existential threat in the United States from police and from white Americans, and the proposition that racism can really be blamed for everything. Now, there are a couple of different types of propositions that are all explanatory. One is conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are completely explanatory. They are all explanatory. And second is the second one is religion. Right? When it comes to conspiracy theory, everything can be explained by malevolent people behind the scenes pulling the strings. Right? This is the sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Or, by the way, the idea of institutional racism, that a bunch of white people are sitting behind the scenes and deliberately attempting to harm black people. Right? If you're making that argument, you're an idiot. There is not some cadre of white people out there who are like, how do we keep black people down today? That does not exist. That is not a thing. If there are people who think that way, they're living in a bunker somewhere in Idaho, right? I mean, that is, and it's like 4 of them. So that's not real.
All right, let's
there's 535 of them, and they're called the U.S. Congress, at least.
Well, I mean, let's go from like the sort of like, it's important to sort of just also assess this guy who is considered to be one of the intellectual pillars on the right and is certainly rewarded as such. But this is who the guy that they write, the New York Times writes that he is like what do they call him? The philosopher, the
cool kids philosopher.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
There is a difference between the idea of a small cabal of people and promoting racism and institutional racism, where you have structures of entities and systems and processes in society that have developed over many, many years that are racist in their outcomes, if not in their intent, although very often many of these institutions are founded, at least in part, on a racist intent that we often forget, right?
Absolutely.
help me out here.
Like the police. I mean, the police in America were founded to do all of the most evil things that you can possibly think of. Catching runaway slaves, putting down strikes and labor uprisings, ethnically cleansing the Southwest, and using colonial tactics learned in the occupation of the Philippines to put down labor unrest in the U.S. So, yeah, it's structural. It's funny because he keeps talking about like theories of racism in this very idealist way that I think some liberals share, perhaps, right? It's just like this, it's a conspiracy. It's a top-down conspiracy designed to keep Black people down just to be mean, I guess, when most leftists have a material analysis of where this oppression comes from that takes into account material factors such as capital's need for labor, such as what happened after the sharecropping system collapsed and tons of descendants of slaves migrated into cities. All of these things combined to create the structural racism and class exploitation that we have today. So if anyone's a conspiracy theorist, it's Ben Shapiro.
Look what those 4 guys in Idaho did.
Yeah,
with budgets.
They dramatically increased police budgets in the wake or as contemporaneously with the great migration of African Americans into urban areas. It is, wow, what those guys in Idaho or Iowa or Idaho, they're really pulling the levers. I think there's also like just a failure of education in this country that allows even like people who are inclined to or less disinclined to hearing this story. I mean, I think a lot of people are just sort of very surprised at like the persistence of institutional governmental policies that were set. And it may be for, a pressure from people who have material interest for it, but to say things like redlining or to deny, everything around that, covenants that say like, you can build this, but it can't be black people there, that we're persistent well into the era of people, many people being alive today who are not that old, not much older than me. And this is ongoing, not just institutional, but literally governmental racism.
And I think people, they misunderstand what the word racism means and how it pairs with institutional racism, particularly in an era of individual tokenization. And the tokenization of people like the first Black president has led many Americans to falsely believe that racism is not a problem. And, there's this whole dialogue, is the president racist? Well, first of all, yes, obviously. And B, it requires power to be racist. I grew up in rural Missouri, and I can remember a particular incident. I think I was as kindergarten or like first or second grade. Had to be second grade. But this kid, Jacob, I remember his saying to me that his mother had told him that my skin was brown because our whole family was dirty and we needed to take a bath. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, your mom must be really, really stupid. I'm sorry. And the reason I was able to think that is because he was powerless too. That's prejudice, but it's not racism. Racism requires a system. Racism requires an industry. Racism requires things like police or banks, institutions to make decisions that make racism not just a matter of individual choice or prejudice, but systems. And that's the whole in Shapiro's analysis. He doesn't understand what racism means because nobody thinks that it's a cabal of people hiding out in a room. What we see in broad daylight is that there is a policy apparatus that welcomes police violence, that there's a policy apparatus that welcomes banks to make pernicious decisions that deny opportunities to entire neighborhoods and communities. We see policy apparatuses and systems that encourage these kinds of racialized inequalities. That's what racism is, not the prejudice of an individual, and it is nothing that can be defused by the inclusion of a few diverse faces.
And it's a bunch of aligned interests who come together to create these mechanisms and these processes, and they don't even have to talk to each other. They just they have the power and they have the same agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of this quote from Stokely Carmichael. I'm probably gonna butcher it now, but he said, "If a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If a white man has the power to lynch me, that's my problem." And I think that really says it all. Race may never completely lose its social meaning for people. There might still be bigots in our society, but it needs to lose its social power for sure. That is the most important thing. And like your perceived race as a raced person or whatever should not determine your position in society, your access to resources. But yeah, in terms of the function they serve in society, the cops are an instrument of class rule. We have to remember that. They protect private property, they manage the effects of austerity, and they keep surplus populations from causing trouble, right? Surplus populations being people who are excluded from the formal or traditional economy in capitalism. So that and that underclass is incredibly racialized in this country, largely due to slavery. So it's all connected. I sound like a hippie when I say that, but
it's true. Things are all connected. You're right about that. Not that it's right that you sound like a hippie, though. Even if you did, there's nothing wrong with that. I live at the corner of Haight and Ashbury, so I'm very much like in the middle of the the neighborhood, at least.
Is Haight Ashbury still like that?
And when you say like that, there are a number of, so there's a commercial sort of like side of the neighborhood that's very kitschy and pays homage to that era. But I would say that there is a street culture of, unhoused, primarily youth who do frankly keep a lot of those values alive. The attitudes of hope, love, and togetherness remain very much alive and well in San Francisco. You can see it in the street protests. I mean, that's what drives us all out to defend our neighbors in the face of this institutionalized violence.
I lived out there in on Valencia and near Dolores Park, like maybe it was 19th or something, but this was almost 30 years ago.
Okay. Oh, wow. That must have been a very different neighborhood. That's where we were 2 days ago. The Mission High School at the foot of Dolores Park was the gathering point for the beginning of the march that spread across the city 2 nights ago.
I suspect it's a little bit different now. There wasn't much going on in that neighborhood in terms of like, it was just starting to sort of like, I got the sense to gentrify. I mean, I've heard it's changed dramatically.
Oh yeah.
There was some great burrito places and some very good, not thrift stores, but like there was a really good, what do you call it? Like Goodwill or something like that. Store, I remember.
A lot of those are still there. And just to tie that to the other part of our conversation, our communities are richer when they include people of lots of different sorts. And frankly, the Mission, one neighborhood here in San Francisco that's been particularly hit by the gentrification wave, not unlike Williamsburg, say in New York. We have these neighborhoods that at one point were very inclusive that have become much less so. Right. And that reflects the very same infusion of capital and capital interest that Jamie was talking about hitting in a very different way. And frankly, they often go together because police are used to effectuate gentrification.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And nowhere is this more clear than the kind of stories like Barbecue Becky or Amy Cooper, where you have people who are using the police like customer service to address issues that make them feel uncomfortable, even when they're calling customer service places other people at risk of lethal state violence. And the willingness of here, it's not state violence. It's private citizens disregarding the safety and the opportunity to respect our neighbors. It just speaks to the idea that what we are confronting now, to a large extent, is institutional, but it's also cultural. And I think that's part of what Jamie was getting at in terms of like, we might have bigots in the future, but we can at least deprive them of power through policy. There is also a cultural battle to be fought in one here too. And I think that's the one that we are all engaged in, we have been long engaged in, and we can't settle for while we continue that cultural struggle to, get to a future where everyone respects each other. We can at least engineer the policy apparatus in the meantime to make sure people get to stay alive.
From your perspective, I mean, what's the relationship between like, and does it flow both ways? What is the culture downstream from that policy apparatus? Or vice versa, or it depends on the day?
Yeah, well, and it depends on the issue and the context. I mean, this is a really recurring question in constitutional theory, and there's plenty of cases to demonstrate the dynamic moving in both directions. So, for instance, you could say with respect to, one example where the law led culture, say Brown versus Board, right? And that was the Supreme Court getting in front, taking multiple decisions to effectuate the desegregation of schools, and the law drove culture there. Contrast that with the Obergefell decision, where the Supreme Court, right? I mean, and I'm proud to have been one of the first advocates for marriage equality in the courts in the time when Democrats did not support equal rights for my gay neighbors. And when the Obergefell decision came down, that was a point where we'd won the culture first, and the culture forced even a conservative Supreme Court to acknowledge the right of consenting adults to marry a partner of their choice. So different issues, different eras, the dynamic and the causation runs both ways. I think of them as a helix where law informs culture, culture informs law. I'll briefly cite the person who I learned that from. That's Lawrence Lessig, who came up earlier in our conversation. That was among the dynamics he talks about in many of his works, is the intersection between law, culture, and particularly in the online sphere and the digital sphere, code and architecture, and all of those things together mutually inform each other.
Well, do we have examples of that helix model that, I mean, I guess we must, right? But you got to go back to like Brandeis era when you're talking about more sort of economic questions on some level, where we shouldn't have children working in factories, and that ends up being we end up seeing the law respond to that.
Mm-hmm. The 40-hour work week too. I mean, the labor mobilization is the third.
All of that from that era was, it feels like to me, the last time where culture influenced the law in terms of economic power in this country, whereas really for the past 50 some odd years, it seems to me, has been more cultural. I mean, there's also, I guess, civic power has been an issue there too. But I mean, I've been struck, just to stay in this territory just for a little bit, on how remarkably similar the courts seem to have been following, like, I don't know, 5-10 years into Reconstruction through, at very least, like the New Deal, to where they are today in terms of like contracting voting rights. Like, we're the idea that we could end up into like a modern Lochner era. I mean, it really, it's freaky. It makes you sort of feel like how many decades do you have to wait until there's actual sort of like durable change with some of these things?
I mean, Reconstruction was being rolled back as soon as it started, pretty much. Like, the radical Republicans had steps that they wanted to take at the end of the Civil War that probably would have fixed things, been effective. Some of them were brutal, executing Confederate generals. Also land reform, 40 acres at a mule, reparations, all of that stuff. A man whose name escapes me right now was talking basically about the labor theory of value when he was like, we worked this land with our hands. We deserve some ownership of it. And for a variety of reasons, partly racism, those things didn't happen.
Assassination.
Well,
was a big part.
Well, Lincoln was more of a moderate than the radical Republicans who I'm talking about. But then obviously his successor was even less so. So that did not happen. But like, we still have to deliver on this promise. And it's been a long time coming. And like I said, it is all connected. And the more I learn, because I'm still learning, the more I learn about history and the more I learn about political economy, the more I think that the only way to really deliver on these Enlightenment values is by transitioning away from capitalism to something like socialism, whatever you want to call it. Maybe we could call it cool world. Maybe that's less alienating to people. Maybe I'll stop calling myself a communist and start saying I just believe in cool world.
I think that would go a long way.
Better brand, certainly. Can I bring Dr. King in here? Because he said very much the same thing here. When Jamie talks about the need to unwind capitalism in the service of achieving racial equity alone, if nothing else, right? King explicitly connected the two. We're talking to some extent about an era in U.S. history now where we're seeing an authoritarian crackdown to deny civil rights, right, and enforcing racism. King located explicitly that you can't unwind racism without unwinding capitalism. And the connecting bridge between the two is the militarized resource extraction that at one point frankly, it's never been confined to international theaters because we did it to indigenous people here in the United States first. Right. But the colonial extraction of resources from people around the world, and now that chicken is coming home to roost. That definition of fascism that you brought to the table, Jamie, I thought was really illustrative, and it's certainly that shoe fits disturbingly well. And King warned us that it takes dismantling all of those pieces, capitalism and militarism, to unwind racism. We can't pretend that racism stands alone.
It's so difficult because it's kind of a catch-22, right? Because racism is a bourgeois ideology. Let's make no mistake about it. The color line, what Du Bois called the color line, has been one of the biggest obstacles to class power throughout the history of this country and throughout the history of the labor movement. So we really need to somehow work against that in order to unite and fight as a class. But like, how are we going to do that if we don't have any power? It's hard. Got to overcome racism to overcome capitalism. Got to overcome capitalism to get rid of racism. I think it all needs to go hand in hand.
We interviewed, and Brendan, maybe you can help me out. The advent of a lot of police techniques in this country today were specifically a function of a program where U.S. police were sent to advise countries in the wake of World War II on how to deal with communist insurrections or would-be insurrections. And what they ended up doing is it was almost like a virus. They took their practices over there, wherever there was, and they learned and got more virulent and then came back here and then applied here in many respects. So a lot of that sort of counter intelligence stuff came in, but that may have been, that comment may have been from a little bit earlier, but
that particularly fits the pattern with Israel, just to locate that, and Saudi Arabia. Right? And I describe our relationship to those countries as one that basically reflects international human rights abuse laundering, where we use taxpayer dollars to fund the military and paramilitary abuses of those countries' citizens by their governments. And then we import their worst practices into the United States. The IDF trains US police, and they train them to do things like keep shooting until the body stops. Every time you hear about somebody who ends up getting shot 60 times, that's Israeli training of US police forces. And they wouldn't have that training if we didn't send the military aid that enables it in the first place. And so the circularity here is really pernicious. And part of the solution has to be unwinding our support for authoritarianism abroad to help diminish the opportunities for authoritarianism to find a root here at home.